Hi, I'm Jim Mirage, and today we're going to visit Philip St. Romain. We visited him at his home in Wichita, Kansas, where he lives with his wife Lisa and their 3 children, and spent time with him at the Spiritual Life Center of the Diocese of Wichita, where he works. After years devoted to the Christian life of prayer, Philip experienced an unanticipated awakening of an inner energy that in ancient India was called Kundalini, and which played an important role in Hindu religious experience. Philip spoke to us first about his Christian journey.
I grew up in a small Cajun town in Louisiana, in south central Louisiana, called Mansura. It was 99% Catholic, and went to Catholic school the first 8 years of my life, and then went to the public school. Graduated from high school in '68, and then went off to college at Southwestern Louisiana University. There was nothing, looking back at those years that even now stands out as being predictive of the things to come in later years. If I were doing a biography of the person who lived then, I'd say it was a pretty normal upbringing and very interested in sports and hunting and fishing. In fact, I probably chose my college career on the basis of that love for hunting and fishing and being out of doors. I chose a major in wildlife management with the hope of being a wildlife biologist on some kind of a beautiful reserve in the mountains perhaps, or even in the marsh, or some kind of wild country. This was the late '60s, and so ecology was an in thing then, and it looked like there would be some kind of a future. There was money and government being allocated for ecological research, and I was interested in all of that, but just really wanted to be out of doors and have a job out of doors. And I did enjoy my college career very much, and ended up getting a bachelor's at USL, University of Southwestern Louisiana, then a master's degree there, and then on to Louisiana State University, where I completed all the work on a PhD in biology, except for the dissertation. So I never got the doctorate. And I became, I guess, somewhat of a naturalist. Ornithology, mammalogy, herpetology, ichthyology. I took everything in all of those fields, as well as plant taxonomy. Took everything, enjoyed everything, ended up teaching everything, leading research parties all around the United States and Mexico, collecting. I just really loved it. All through this time, I was what you might call a faithful church-going Catholic. All through my college career, I would go to Mass on Sunday, and I never quit believing anything that the church taught, but it certainly wasn't in the forepart of my mind. It wasn't something I had in my mind very often. It was just something I had a good conscience, a good moral conscience. But it just wasn't there for me. It wasn't informing my daily life in any way. It wasn't a living reality. I went to church, and so I guess because I had a nice, quiet feeling there and would have felt too guilty to not go in those days. But I can see now that those years in college did raise some very deep questions for me, just about God and creation and how it all worked. Most of my teachers were evolutionists, and they were, if not atheists, agnostic, certainly. And they all tended to look at Christians as somewhat fundamentalists, and so to them, the issue of a 6-day account of creation versus evolution was one that was constantly on the table. one which I had never really had much of a problem with as a Catholic. But just from, I guess, the attitude, the whole negative attitude about all things religious was there in the academia, especially in the physical sciences. And it had undermined considerably my intellectual convictions about the faith, which I had picked up through the years, but had never really reflected on much. That's where I was in the fall of 1973, just beginning to work on my master's degree in biology, and still a church-going person, and beginning to wonder how these things could all somehow fit together, if they could. To back up a little, in the spring of 73 rather, as a result of a field trip in Mexico, I picked up a disease called tularemia, rabbit fever, and spent some time in the hospital with pneumonia, and probably came close to dying. And I remember at that time thinking that it might be odd to die. It was a curious kind of a feeling. It's not something I was afraid of, but neither is it something that I was looking forward to in any way. It was just like dying was like going to sleep, and maybe you wake up somewhere else and maybe you don't. I didn't know. But my dad had made a Cursillo retreat and had come back very much alive in his faith. And I had a couple of friends that had also gone to Cursillo. So while I was in the hospital, I said, maybe it's time I do something about that. Maybe, obviously, I don't believe very strongly, but neither do I disbelieve. Maybe I really should take some time and see just where I am with that. And so after healing up a bit from that illness and being pretty much full steam by the fall, I decided to go on the Cursillo. Looking back now, I'd say there's really nothing that I heard at that Cursillo that was great shakes. In fact, some of the theology that was presented I would probably object to. Some of the tactics, keeping us up for long hours and hearing long talks, and some of that I would disapprove of, but all I can tell you is that it worked on me at that time in my life. I didn't come out with any answers to my intellectual questions. In fact, I came out with more questions than ever. But I did come out with a real sense of God's love for me being alive inside of me, a kind of a heart-level awakening. I just remember walking around the campus after that and saying to myself, if you never have another day like this, please remember for the rest of your life that God is real and God is loving, and if you never know this again, but that this is what it's like after death, by God, it's worth waiting for. It was so beautiful. It's like everything was colored with this joy and this peace and this love. And there was something about the experience that revealed how it had always been there in some way, that in feeling that way, that fall, I got in touch with all the many other times in my life when I had felt that way. And there were times of being close in the family, of helping with the dishes, of milking the cow, of just walking outside on a clear fall day, and saw that those were all experiences of God that I had known but never really been able to name. And Cursillo kind of helped me to identify that this was God. I mean, it was so alive for me. And I had a small group of friends at southwestern Louisiana who had been through Cursillo or similar types of retreats, and we hung out together and we prayed together and had a community that kept this alive. It was just a blessed awakening, a time of real heart-type emotional awakening. One of my friends was very involved in charismatic renewal, and I didn't know a thing about that. And when we would be in church sometimes praying, we would generally pray the rosary. After that, he would ask us if it was all right if he would pray in tongues. I had no idea what he was talking about when he first mentioned that. And so I said, well, that's fine with me. And so we were quiet a while, and then he began to pray in tongues out loud. And it was very strange sounding that what he was doing, but on the other hand, I knew this guy. He was an all right guy, you know. And so I began to learn about charismatic renewal from him and what that was all about. This is how he had followed up his Cursillo retreat, was involvement in charismatic renewal. And he played guitar for a prayer group, and I also played guitar, so I thought maybe I could just at least go play guitar there and I wouldn't have to be involved. Many times in ministry I've used the guitar that way, something to stand behind instead of to project into. So I went, and this was still in the fall of '73, shortly after the Cursillo, while I was still on the top of Mount Tabor, enjoying all those beautiful vibrations from that retreat experience. So I went to a prayer meeting in the fall of '73, and a very gifted and anointed preacher, I'd say, named Richard Charismatic, was a prayer leader at a little church in Abbeville, Louisiana. And he had such a powerful teaching, I mean, about the reality of God's presence in our lives and the reality of the gift of the Spirit. And I listened and I believed, and I guess, but I really could not identify with the kind of praise that people were doing. And I remember kind of standing back at my first few prayer services and say, well, this praise Jesus stuff they're doing, all this praise God. I mean, God's all right. God doesn't need all that. Thank you, Lord, that's fine. But why do they go on and on and on with this stuff? But I kept playing the guitar, and I enjoyed that, and I enjoyed being with my friend there. But Shastri had a gift of laying hands on people too, and when he would do, they would seem to fall on the floor to be, they call that now the resting in the Spirit. And I remember one time we were sitting in pews, and he would come behind the pew and lay hands on you if you wanted. If you didn't want, you could request a healing or a petition or something. He'd bend down and listen. And he asked me if I wanted anything, and I said, no, not really. And he says, can I lay hands on you? I said, fine with me. He says, don't be uptight. And nothing happened, absolutely nothing. I didn't fall on the floor. I did feel my heart slowing down, but here's this guy next to me just conks out on the seat. And as I say, I thought it odd. Nevertheless, some kind of seed was planted by that, and I continued to wonder what the baptism of the Spirit was like, and continued to wonder if something like that hadn't begun with Cursillo. And continued to pray with my friends and so forth. And then, shortly before Christmas of '73, while praying with them one evening, I really felt like I was beginning to almost get choked up inside. Some deep kind of feeling was stirring. And they sensed it, and they asked if they could lay hands on me and pray with me to help whatever was happening to happen. And so I did, and I didn't know what I was supposed to do to pray in tongues or anything like that. I thought maybe you became possessed by some kind of spirit and lost all control of your verbal abilities, and that you were possessed by God. And they said, no, that's not it. Just focus your mind on God and let your mouth give praise to God in whatever way. And I began to do that, and it's as though my tongue became loosened in the way I was able to begin uttering syllables and sounds that didn't make a bit of sense to me, but which had the function of opening up. They seemed to open something up inside. Some really deep reservoir of surrender was opened up in that. I felt my whole insides relaxing and just really being given to God in this way of prayer. I guess right now I would have to say that the best thing that ever happened to me in my life is that, the baptism of the Spirit, because it has given me a way of prayer that's responsible for everything that's happened spiritually since. It's a way of continuing to really surrender in a way that I don't understand, but that is nevertheless real. I could give it a little interpretation now and say that a lot of these syllables and things are ways of activating the chakras, the energy centers. The Hindus have these sounds they use and they meditate on to activate chakras. And I think as one prays in tongues and just runs these syllables, Yamanadido or whatever, that the chakras are being massaged or activated or something. The whole person is being awakened by that. So a new kind of prayer happened. I had a big love relationship that developed about that time. I was really, really in love and on fire for Jesus. And it stayed like that. I was on this tremendous high for about a year at least a year. Meanwhile, I was also doing a lot of reading. I was feeding my mind. I had a real appetite to go through adult education classes on the Catholic faith, learn more about the Bible, how the Bible came to be written, very basic stuff that I needed to have again. I had all the answers, like the Baltimore Catechism training I had was there for me and very helpful. Who made you? God made you. What is the purpose of life? To love and serve God. And now I started to reflect more on those old answers, and they made more sense. But I was very hungry to learn more about the faith. And so there was this intellectual searching and struggling, and especially religion and science issues. I was still dealing with a lot of that. And then my Bible study, learning the various criticisms of Scripture helped to understand that the Bible is not a scientific book, and that science had its place in the search for truth, and it could overstep its bounds into the realm of religion, but that was a separate realm. I began to make some helpful distinctions there. The roof began to come down, or the bubble began to be burst somewhere in '74 when I left Southwestern and came to Louisiana State and was living with one of my old Christian friends. That romantic relationship in Lafayette began to kind of start to fade. Those long-term relationships don't always work out so well, and this one wasn't. It was a strange new place, and I was growing increasingly disenchanted with biology and of making a career in that. Nevertheless, I continued to go to school, to teach classes. I didn't know what else to do, but I figured I'd continue with that for a while. I thought about joining the priesthood, but I felt very called to minister and give my life to God. But I wasn't sure if priesthood was the right way. But I gave it a lot of thought in that time anyway. By the spring of '75, that romantic relationship, had pretty much ended. And with it, my disenchantment with my career seemed to just come to a head as well. I couldn't see myself doing that for the rest of my life. There was not even being on a nice reserve in the mountains and being a naturalist out there. It just didn't. That dream was dying and close to dead by the spring of '75. Plus, I don't know if it was connected with that, but I had some really deep depressions that were beginning to set in that I couldn't always put a name on. Some of them were related to the lost relationship. Some of them were related to the dying of the dream, and some of them just seemed to have come from nowhere. And anxieties and fears and things like that. Probably by May of '75, I was a neurotic, first-class neurotic. I was doing the bare minimum. I was getting up, getting myself to work, teaching my class, coming back, spending more time in prayer, too. Prayer was the only place where I could just feel at peace, and it was okay just to be. And I didn't have to do anything or make any plans. I could just be with God. I had already begun to experience, I don't know if we want to call it contemplation, but I think it's very much like that. Just being with God in silence and sensing God with me in silence. I would read a scripture, I would think about it a bit, and then I would just sit there quietly. And the glossolalia, or the prayer in tongues, came and went. It emerged spontaneously, and I allowed it to be, and it would clean something out. But it always seemed like every time it would heal something, it would raise something deeper. And I couldn't always put a name to it. It was sometimes just general anxiety, fear. I had a real bad case of the angst, the existential dread, except when I was in prayer. So I spent some time in prayer, and otherwise I was scared. Didn't know what I was scared of. Nothing was dangerous. So I had some deep emotional things coming up. Looking back now, I'd say that I was dealing with what we call adult-child issues of maybe some family of origin issues. I don't know. Like I said, many times these things there were no memories associated with them. They were just deep down feelings. So I spent a lot of 1975, the summer and the fall, reading and reading and reading. I read Jung, I read Maslow, I read philosophers of different kinds, I'd read theologians, doing a lot of writing in my journal. And the kind of focus of all of this, the real focusing question was what is the nature of this relationship between the person and God? Because I was beginning to feel in myself like there was no place that separated us. And yet there was the fear, and there was the fact of my willfulness that was still there, and sinfulness. Yet I was beginning to feel like maybe I had gotten myself into something that was way, way over my head with all of this prayer and praying in tongues and whatnot. Like maybe I wasn't even in control of anything, and maybe it might not come out so well either. And maybe I could go crazy with all of this. I stayed in that place from the spring of 75 and until at least the summer of 76, at which time I was already dating my wife-to-be Lisa, but still had that going on really badly. And then slowly it began to lift. By the spring of 76, it was beginning to lift, and by the summer of 76, it had almost altogether gone completely. That the angst was not an ever-present reality. I wasn't walking around scared. Now, while I had all this going on, I was still doing my job and fulfilling my duties and plugging away at my career and doing dissertation research. But I wasn't what you might call ambitious for that. I would just do what had to be done. Go home, read, think, pray. Take long, long walks on the levee next to the Mississippi River. And talk with a few friends that I had about it. And some of them were going through the same thing, so they weren't much help at all. And we would just kind of cry on each other's shoulders about all of that. But it began to lift by the summer of 76. And it was a slow thing. It wasn't a sudden thing. But I just started to notice that I felt pretty good. I was feeling pretty good. I didn't have the old dreams, but I still was very much me, Phil. There was a sort of a continuity in my emotional memory. I was in touch with the person I always had been. But inside of me was where the big change was, that black hole where the fear seemed to be coming from, and where the depression and a lot of things were coming from. It seemed to be closed for some reason. It wasn't a black hole anymore. It was a place where God and I were one. So by that summer, the situation kind of was like, I felt like God and I were one inside. So there was a union inside. And yet, at the level of intellectual or conscious awareness, there was I could be aware of that union. It was like an unconscious union that I was conscious of. But at the level of consciousness, there was still very much the possibility and the fact of willfulness, of desire, and so forth. I now call that situation the spirit-centered ego, meaning at the level of consciousness there was still a self-concept that I was working out of, but it was a Christian self-concept. I saw myself as a different person. In going through that, what I now call a kind of a dark night experience from 75 to 76, even late fall 74, a dark night where self-concept changed and a surrender in an unconscious level was really that was happening there. So I had this Christian self-concept. I knew myself in terms of Christ as a Christian person with Christian goals, Christian self-judgments, Christian identifications, wanting to be minister. It's all of how I understood myself was still self-concept talk, but now Christian. Feeling very strong inside myself, feeling inside of myself a real a love that I just wanted to share with everybody. That was what was moving me to ministry. How can I give this away? What can I do to help people come to know what this is? So I got involved in retreat work. I felt like the best thing I could do was to lead others to that kind of experience too, and let them take it into whatever realm of life they wanted to. I felt that was better than going out and, say serving the poor or doing something that wasn't going to deal directly with conversion. So for me, ministry was about leading people to conversion and then supporting them in the ongoing conversion process. That wasn't, again, the way. In 75, when I was going through this dark night, I remember feeling just the opposite. Like the last thing I ever wanted to do was to help other people become Christian, because then they'd end up as miserable as I was. And the only reason I was miserable was because of Jesus. I mean, he was the one that was making me sick. And I remember just really identifying with Job and the others and saying, Lord, you make me so sick. Then identifying with Teresa of Avila, who talked about how sick Jesus made her at times, and or she said, Lord, why don't you have more friends? And he says, those who are my friends I reprove and chastise. And she says, well, no wonder you don't have many friends. And I could really identify with that. But then when I came out of it, I said, this was good. This was a good thing I went through. I'm not caught up in the world anymore. I'm not part of that world system. I'm not influenced by that. I was really free. And so I did get involved in ministry. I was a campus minister. I was doing retreats, doing some counseling. I began to make 8-day directed retreats as a sort of a yearly practice, if possible. We had small children by 78. So I was in a pretty good place after I came out of that dark night experience. Ministering, loving it, having a family going here, and still loving to read, growing still in my mind very much, and it looked very good. That's how life was going, very well. There was still the glossolalia coming in. I was still being very faithful to morning prayer. My practice in those days, as for years, was to get up early in the morning before anything else happened and quiet myself with a little walk outside, read a scripture and think about it a bit, and then just be with God in quiet. And the quiet was deepened sometimes by the praying in tongues, and sometimes that didn't happen. It happened, I guess, when it needed to, and when it didn't need to, that was all right. But then feeling all the rest of the day like I was right with God, like inside of me there was real strength, a quiet kind of peace and joy that was always there. And when I missed that morning prayer, feeling really out of sorts, even nauseated at times, as though my stomach was not relaxed. I figured I had some kind of addiction to prayer, but I was all right with that. It was a good addiction. It's a positive addiction, okay? And so that was the way things were with prayer for years. In 1980, I left campus ministry. Our ministry situation at LSU changed. The bishop ordered some people out, and some new people came in, and eventually we all got swept out. And I got into the field of substance abuse counseling, mainly because I needed a job. And a friend of mine offered me a position working with the state of Louisiana in substance abuse counseling. I was doing some writing then and said, well, I'll be able to minister through my writing more, but substance abuse counseling also seemed to be a good way to do things. It is the one kind of counseling that really makes use of spirituality to help people recover from addiction. I was able to get out and do a lot of talks before the public, and so it was a job, but it gave me still gave me some outlet for this incredible desire that I had to bring people onto the spiritual journey in some way. And I said, well, now we can do this. Drugs are a problem, and we can't lead people when you work for the state to Christ, but you can take them right to the door. And by talking about spirituality, that was okay. Just so you didn't get specific with church or something. During that time, in working for the state in 1980 to 85, a lot of our training was very good for me. I, of course, had experienced some healing from some emotional things during that dark night experience, 75, 76, but in our training, we went through a lot of group therapy or group counseling kinds of experiences, and found myself on the hot seat quite a few times with some of the groups I was in, getting confronted about some of my attitudes and how I communicated, how I came across, and learning a lot about myself. This was something that I had not experienced in church. That deepening of interpersonal relationships that comes from a total emotional honesty. And I was very attracted to that in 12-step groups like Alcoholics Anonymous and Al-Anon, about the depth, the honesty, the genuine community that seems to come out of that. I really grew from that and began to see how some of my relationships were in fact hurting because of some of my ways of communicating, and how even though I was very much a minister and very honestly wanting to serve God with my life, how sometimes I really wasn't very patient with people, nor accepting them where they were, willing to let them have their journey. Discovered some controlling things about myself. In other words, there were some things there that I would probably have never become aware of in campus ministry, because I was able to isolate from that kind of relational honesty. So it was, again, a hard time. There was some stripping that was going on, not on an unconscious level there. It was more of the conscious attitudes and relational patterns. The ego, I guess you'd say, was really taking a beating from some of that. So I worked for the state from 80 to 85 and did that kind of growing. And during those years, I was finally successful in getting some books published. The first one, Becoming a New Person, on using the 12 steps as a conversion process for the Christian journey. Catholic Answers to Fundamentalist Questions, which met a need. It is just a book that came out at the right time and just began to sell and sell and sell. Praying the Daily Gospels, which uses the daily gospel reading at Mass as a reflection, a daily reflection. And those three books came out in 84 and were doing well, so I began to think, well, you know, working with the state, it's been good, but this program was really getting its budget cut every year. Our hands were being tied more and more. It wasn't as satisfying an outlet for ministry. Why don't I just go on my own, you know, do retreats around the country and I could counsel part-time with a treatment center, continue to write books. So I played around with that idea for a year, and my wife was working. Our children were in school. Figured, all right, let's do a real midlife thing. And, I knew enough about midlife and the psychologies that go with that to say, on my 35th birthday, I will start this new career. And so I resigned from the state, early enough to make all the transitions. And September 30th, 1985, I was on my own. I was operating a little corporation I'd set up called Personal Growth Services. Didn't have much business, but I figured it would take a year or two, to get it going. I had my retirement money from the state refunded, had royalty monies coming in regularly. The books looked like they'd be steady. I had more books that I was writing, and the publishers were interested. And I put together some brochures and sent them out to treatment centers and retreat centers, and started to wait for a response that I was certain would come. Well, it didn't come. Or else they'd schedule me for 2 years down the road because they were booked that year. So, okay, I'll offer some workshops in this area and advertise, and surely people will come. And they didn't. I'd barely break even. I'd maybe make publicity costs. Nevertheless, I hung in there with it and continued. I could always do counseling, and I did a lot of freelance counseling. And so we lived like that for years, for 5 years. We discovered almost right away, after I went into business for myself, that we were pregnant again. And that meant that my wife would have to stop working full-time and maybe not work at all for a year or so, or at least very much part-time. And it meant it was going to be difficult to have a nice, quiet house to concentrate and do some writing and stuff again. So that was a little, tension that was introduced about that time. And it was around that time that what I'm now calling an awakening of Kundalini began to happen. Shortly after that break with the state in October of 85, well, first let me back up and say that in order to make that final leap, I made an 8-day retreat in the summer of 85, and there experienced on that retreat another bout with fear that I had not anticipated. I had been pretty much relieved of deep down fears, except for occasional little episodes. Since 75, 76, I had not really had much problem with fear or anxiety. And I went to this retreat to discern, should I get out of this job or should I stay in? I was going to use Ignatian principles and go through this process and all that stuff with the director. And it's almost like the Lord was not even interested in the least bit with that. Every time I tried to bring the focus into option A versus option B and to see what my levels of detachment were, the issue turned out to be fear and trust. Fear and trust. Almost like the Lord was saying, I don't care what you do. You can do it if you want. If you don't want, that's all right. What I'd really like to talk to you about, Phil, is trust, control, things like that. And I remember shaking so badly in bed one night in that retreat that the mattress was literally, and I remember laughing at to myself, saying, look how scared I am, and I don't know what I'm afraid of. Why am I so afraid? It was just all this fear, and yet there was a serenity there too, like, this is necessary. Just sit with this and sit in it. So I would go and sit before the Blessed Sacrament and just have that serenity and being in God's presence, but still have all this fear. I said, well, it's just fear about getting into the future and this new life, and will my family make it or not? Will we be able to do it? Well, it could have been about that again. Like, I think it was just fear. Fear that is there because of some alienation we have from God within. And that was being surrendered and transformed in this retreat. Well, after the retreat was over, and getting into this new time in life, I said, well, I'm going to follow up this retreat by taking a regular time of prayer longer than I've been used to. My custom was to take about 30 minutes. So I said I'd extend it for an hour, which was no problem. I had the time now. And on an 8-day retreat, I was spending 5 to 6 hours a day in quiet prayer. And didn't see where one a day would be all that different. And it wasn't a problem. I enjoyed the time. I had for years been able to just sit in quiet in God's presence, feeling a sense of inner communion with God. But after a few months of that, something began to happen that was totally unanticipated. That in the resting in the quiet, by December of 85, or certainly by the spring of 86, there would come a time in sitting in the quiet when my breath would seem to stop completely. My breathing would become very shallow. The ability to be present to God as other seemed to break down. It looked like everything would stop. Thinking, breathing, moving, and with the eyes closed would come to just everything, a complete, total stop.
Philip is the Associate Director for Lay Leadership and Development of the Spiritual Life Center, one of the newest and most carefully planned retreat centers in the country. Here he helps direct a wide variety of programs, as well as give retreats and workshops. And in this modern setting, Philip told us how he encountered the ancient serpent power, or Kundalini, of India.
It looked like everything would stop. Thinking, breathing, moving, and with the eyes closed would come to just everything, a complete, total stop. Everything except the awareness that I was. That's all. It's the awareness that in this moment I am. That's all that there was, just that. And in my journal I call that point zero, of picking up a phrase from Suzuki, D.T. Suzuki, whom I had read, and his correspondence with Merton and so forth. It's probably not what Suzuki meant when he used point zero. He says this thing, zero equal infinity, But I felt like I was collapsing in some way into the now, that there was no movement, and so I was coming fully into the now, and there was nothing there but me. So naturally I wondered where God might be. Where was God in this process? I was very accustomed to having a sense of God's presence within, a God to whom I prayed. Where was God when I collapsed into the now? It didn't feel like I was running away from God. It felt very peaceful. That would happen on occasion, and then through the spring of 86 it would happen more and more. It would happen almost every time that shortly into the time of prayer, I would have the shortening of breath and the breath stoppage, and then the eyes closed would begin to see a yellowish kind of light. That the visual background would move from black to yellow. And in simply observing this light, it was a very beautiful kind of light that was appearing. There was an ability just to watch it without thinking about it, that the light seemed to be training attention to a way of being without thinking. So there was very little breathing, and there was this light, and I just felt like I was somehow lost in that, like I was just watching this light. I could draw back from it, but it was like I was one with it, and in watching it, it deepened that kind of experience of disappearing into the now that was happening. I was, of course, wondering what that all meant too. There was an intellectual kind of awareness that could be awake even in that point zero experience that would say, well, I wonder what this all means. Nevertheless, here I am. And that was a curious thing to me too. I began to wonder just how in the world are we put together? This intellectual part of me that is capable of watching everything and even that part that is capable of jumping into the surrender process at times. And so I began to write more and more about that in my journal and pay close attention to how this was affecting me outside of prayer. The effect seemed to be very good. It seemed to be, I was becoming more lighthearted, I was becoming more peaceful, more patient, much more able to be here now outside of prayer, much less preoccupied, much less wondering about the future and how I ought to be preparing myself for it, like I was constantly doing before. Always caught up a lot in the future. So I began to, I guess, expect this point zero experience to be a part of my prayer, and it began to be a part of my prayer every day. With the lights began to, or the light coloration began to form circles that I called mandalas, round. I didn't know what they were. I thought that they probably had something to do with the way the brain was perceiving the change in energy inside of me. And that's not a bad insight to this day. I think that's a pretty good insight. Began to realize that it's not the physical eyes that see, it's the brain that sees, that even the physical eyes take information into the brain where they're decoded, and the brain sees out of the visual center. So I was seeing this change of energy that was happening as a result of the change in the breathing and the just resting fully in the now that was happening. And I talked it over with some friends that were trained in spiritual direction and told them about it. And one of them said, oh, that's okay, you're just resting in the center, whatever that meant. Asked him if he might point me towards some literature on that, and he was unable to suggest anything. But that's what he said, it was resting in the center. I was going to daily mass during this time. When I got into work for myself in '85, I started to go to mass daily, and made a commitment to that as soon as these different things started happening, I wanted to be sure that I stayed close to the Eucharist, just to be reassured of that I had this contact with Christ in that way. And that has continued to this day. So this was going on. By the summer of '86, in addition to that, all through the day, I began to have these incredible insights popping into my head. These short little pithy phrases, so full of meaning, and that seemed to summarize so much of my reading through the years, and even began to give answers to so many of the questions that I was having. And began to write them down, and I filled one notebook, then I filled another, then I filled another. And this still goes on, notebooks and notebooks and notebooks, full of these little proverb-type things. Sometimes they're prayers, and sometimes they're philosophical, metaphysical kinds of insights that are happening. Very frequently, they're just practical advice. At first, they seemed to come spontaneously, like I never knew when these insights would like I'd be walking along, just doing my day's work, and all of a sudden I would begin to realize things. I would begin to have these insights. And I'd run to write them down because I didn't want to forget them. They were so good. And then I began to discover that I could be in dialogue in some way with that by posing a question, holding on to the question, and waiting for the answer to come. My interpretation of that was that somehow through the intuitive channel there was contact made with either a higher realm of the self or soul, or perhaps our guardian angel, I don't know, or Christ himself, I don't know. but that it was obviously not coming out of, any kind of discursive activity on my part. I wasn't generating this stuff. I was very much aware that I was being given guidance. I'll give you an example of one of them, the one that continues to be the most meaningful to me. Let's see if I can get this something about get into the now of life, believing you are loved by God, alert for love's invitations, willing to let go of your way. It's just simple little stuff like that that seem to, that's it. I mean, what else can, that's all, that's it, right there, that one little phrase there. Or God is your joy, ever enough. God is now, your joy is now. The word now, 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 now. All of these little phrases, all of these little sayings were about allow this thing to happen, allow your attention to be molded into a now. Began to wonder if that might not be what eternal life is, about just being here now all the time. Like that's what God is, always here now, we say. Maybe if I were here now, I would experience something of eternal life. Began to discover how so much of attention was caught in the past or projecting into the future, and how that was narrowing more and more into now. But there was a part of me that was very resistant to that, that was, well, hell, if I let go of the past, I might not know who I am. And if I don't think about the future, I mean, I might become some kind of a shiftless bum, that just, those were all very neat little tricks of the false self that were being introduced, but they certainly kept me from making some kind of a complete surrender for quite some time. But now, be here now in love. Be here now in love. It's here now. Just be here. Just let go. It's not. All day long this stuff is coming at me. And it looked like even when I would open the scriptures it was saying that. Like I had never really gotten it. Sort of like, the way it came to me another time was, let's say you were an Elvis Presley fan and you discovered that he was coming to the Holiday Inn in Baton Rouge, where I lived at the time. Wouldn't you go to where Elvis was to see him, to be with him, to have a contact with him? Well, I probably would. If I were an Elvis fan, I would go to the right place at the right time to see Elvis. Well, good. Come into the now and you'll know God. That's where God is. If you're somewhere else, you're in the wrong place. So again and again, you have to go to the right place and be there at the right time. It was happening sort of like at the level of thinking. I was getting all of these messages, and the level of energy, I seemed to be moving in that direction too. There was nothing to do except to let the experience unfold. The only other choice would have been to not pray at all, because by the fall of '86 there was no way to take prayer time without this happening within the first few minutes. It was almost a drudgery by then to read the scripture. It was like my mind was not interested in what the scripture had to say. It was not wanting to reflect on that. It was not wanting to get meaning out of that. I was hardly able anymore to put myself into a gospel scene and interact with Jesus. I did it anyway, and then it was sort of like, this higher part of me was saying, well, thank God you're finally finished with that. Now shut up and just be here now in love. Just please, will you put that journal down and sit down and be quiet? And I would, and the lights would come, and the breathing would become very short and shallow, and it was just a very beautiful time. I began to feel that I was somehow fading away too during this time, like I really didn't have much of a sense of myself anymore. Like, the more I came into the now, the less there was of any kind of a solid self that I could call me. I began during that time to lose too what I would call my emotional memory. I began to lose a sense of emotional continuity with my past. I didn't lose my memory. I could remember something that happened, but I couldn't remember what I felt like in that time. Where before, before it's even 85, I could remember, let's say going hunting in the fall with my dad. And I could kind of feel what that felt like. I was in touch with. There was an emotional continuity. Now I could just remember what we did and that we did things and so forth. It was a sort of an emptied memory. But I couldn't feel that person alive anymore. And so I began to wonder what that meant. Figured maybe there was some kind of healing of memory that was happening, and the whole memory had to be taken away before a new one could be given back. But at any rate, I didn't have a sense of self. But I was still all right. I was doing counseling. I was doing, I was parenting a little kid by then. We had a Paul in the summer of '86. I was still writing. I was doing some good work, but I just didn't know who I was. And the odd part about it was that was okay. I didn't know who in the world I was, but that wasn't a problem at all. I could do anything, could do everything I had always done without knowing who I was. The problem would come if I would say not knowing who you are is a bad thing. You must be sick or something. Then I would begin to feel some panic feelings. So I began to notice that as soon as I introduced a judgment about that situation, I began to be in bad shape. So I began to say, well, maybe I don't even need to say if this is bad or good. It just is. I don't need to say if I'm sick or healthy. I just am. And whatever it is, it's out of my hands to replace it or not. About that time, I came onto the writings of Bernadette Roberts on her books about no self. And how I came upon those books is a story. I would see them advertised in book catalogs and things, but I said, well, I don't need to read that. Why should I read about that? But it just kept, there was something about those books that something inside of me kept saying, well, you need to read what she has to say. You need to kind of. So by the spring of '87, I was at a religious ed conference in New Orleans, and I had a booth, and I was trying to sell books and trying to get myself invited to do retreats and workshops. And there was a booth by Alverno Bookstore there. And I remember finding myself walking toward there nervous, feeling really nervous. What if they didn't have that book on no self? What am I going to do? And so I went and I just stood there and asked the woman at the counter, do you have those books on no self? And she looked at me and she says, you mean the books by Bernadette Roberts? I said, I guess. She says, no. And my heart just sunk, and I was amazed at my reaction to all of that. She says, would you like me to order them for you? And I hardly even heard her saying that. And finally I scribbled her, I ordered them, and I was really crushed that they weren't there. I didn't even know what they were about. Well, the first one came a few weeks later, The Path to No Self, and I read it in 2 nights, the whole book. There was a lot of it that I didn't understand, and some that I still don't. Nevertheless, it seemed to me that one of the things she was saying was that everything we could call a self, which did include the affective memory and intentionality and so forth, could pass away, and that could be part of the Catholic spiritual journey. That even could be a very good thing. It could be a way of entering into a deeper kind of union with God. And so I was very much, as a result of that book, encouraged just to let go into what was wanting to happen. And I sort of said, as long as I don't sin, I'll let what happens. As long as I don't feel myself drawn to let go of my responsibilities to my family. And at one point I even wrote those down just in case I might forget one day, in case my memory might go completely nuts. I wrote them down just so I would have them there. Cook breakfast, wash dishes, cut grass once a week, stuff like that. I mean, my memory was really getting a working over there, and I wasn't quite sure how it would turn out. As long as I didn't sin, and as long as I did my responsibilities, then I would allow whatever was happening to happen. And that seemed a fair deal to me. And I would go to Mass every day, continue just to be sure that I had that kind of contact with Jesus, and that he would in some way be involved with this. Whether it was a natural process or supernatural, I didn't know. But the more it went, the less there was of me. And the less there was of me, the less there was of God, which was kind of strange too. So I began to wonder not only where I was, but where God was. Where was this loving other that I had known for so many years as a living presence within me, about me, and between me and others and so forth? That was gone. Now there was just now, this big old now. In the spring of '87, driving to New Orleans one day, I was wondering kind of no, this was a little later. I'll get to that later. Talk about that. By the fall of '87, there was still the lights and the shortness of the short breathing and so forth. Began to experience some physical sensations of an energy running along the sides of my face, of just an incredible compulsion to shut my eyes tightly, so tightly I thought they would burst, of a fizzling on top of my head in the crown region, just like fizzling, like carbonation coming, up from a soft drink or something, that was fizzling up and then fizzling and going beyond. And with those sensations was just a sense of being really cleansed and opened in some new ways. As that began to happen more and more, I found that this was going on through the day, that even while riding around in my truck, the prickly pain and the sizzling sensation would go on. The sense of energy running down the side of my cheeks and causing the muscles to contract in certain ways, that was going on, that was continuing. That I could induce that pain, in fact, that not pain, a prickly pain, but it was pleasant too. It was painful but pleasant. I could induce that by grimacing a certain way, that by moving my ears and eyes back a certain way, I could make it stronger, and that by moving my attentional expression another way, I could just about stop it. But that when I would make it stop, I would begin to feel a real buildup of pressure at the base of my neck here, and along the area around the ears. I would have this real pressure. So I would allow it to happen. And it was pleasant enough, and it seemed to keep me pretty clear-headed. And there was no real negative consequence from it, and I didn't know what it was. All along I had been reading more of the old Catholic mystical literature on some of the gratiae gratis datae, they call them, extraordinary phenomenon, sometimes evidenced. And I said, well, yeah, I've got some of that going on. I don't know what it all means, but I think that's what a lot of these lights and things are all about, or is just some extraordinary phenomenon associated with prayer. Well, when the fizzling and all of that started, I couldn't find a thing anymore. Couldn't find a thing. Or closing the eyes, or the energy running along the sides of the cheeks, and things like that. So I allowed it. I mean, I couldn't. The only way to stop all this, I guess, would have been to stop praying, and I'm not sure even that would have done it. By this point, this process was really very much in gear. I mean, it was awake. The energy process was awake by then. So that's what was going on in the spring of or rather the fall of '87. By the spring of '88, there was no longer a sense of the old Phil. And I was really grieving that. I was really sad. I can see now that I had to really grieve about that. This person that I've put together, even the Christian self that I was, it was gone. And in its place there was this head sizzling, kind of thing, and this ability to be here now, but there was very, very little affect. I could do my job and project some kind of warmth, but inside of me I didn't feel any sense of life I didn't feel any sense of joy or peace. It just felt like I was there, and just there. Not dead, not alive, just here I am, that's all, just there. I wasn't quite so sure it was a very good deal to have no self, if that's what I had. Wasn't sure that it was a very good thing I was into. Wondered if something very bad had not happened. Those were thoughts that I had. They never could penetrate the emotional or the deeper core within. They were never allowed to really disturb me, but they were there. And the deeper emotional levels, what there was, though, the grief was there. The sense of this person is gone. And granted, that person was always changing anyway. There was still something about that person that there was a continuity, probably from the age of 2 years old, about that person. There had been an ongoing development of that person that was one stage of development. We might call it the ego project or whatever, I don't know. It was now gone. And I was very sad about that. And about that time, I started waking in the night and crying and crying and crying. And I wouldn't know what I was crying about it. But the grief would feel a little better at the end of that. And the prayer began to change then, the spring of '88. The sizzling sensations were there, the energy was there, the lights were there. But in addition, there was more weeping, just a real crying. Sometimes in morning prayer, sometimes in evening prayer. A lot of tears associated with that. And always at the end of it, a feeling of being relieved of something. It wasn't just tears of misery, it was tears of healing or something. That grieving went on through the summer of '88, and about that time too, in the summer of '88, the thing on the top of my head began to hurt. It wasn't there wasn't much sense of anything, relief happening, but there was energy going there, but there was a real tightness there. It was as though the energy was wanting to get through something, and that something was closed. I would sit there, and I remember it was as though I would sit in prayer, and it was as though everything within a few minutes would be centered on the top of my head. Every ounce of my energy and attention would be there. I could not stop it from going there, unless, of course, I wouldn't pray. But that's where it would go, and it would feel like I was just, all of me was right there. And during that summer, as I was grieving and struggling with this thing on top of my head, I was having to spend lots and lots of time in quiet. It was a slow time for work, but my books were doing well, so we had a nice royalty check on the way, so I wasn't panicking about that. My wife was going to be able to go back to work, so I wasn't panicking about money. And I would take 3, 4, 5 hours a day just to sit in my little office on my little prayer stool and let this thing happen. Let myself just feel drawn to the top of my head. And I remember that would go on at night too. I would be awakened at night and feel like I had to just sit like that. And my head would feel so hot. The top of my head was burning hot. And then 20 minutes, 30 minutes after prayer, it would feel ice cold on the top of my head. Cold as can be. By the end of that summer, and one of my times in prayer, I remember just feeling like, my God, the top of my head is going to be torn open. My brains are going to fly out. I just felt like that. And I had some kind of an image form in my mind of like some kind of a little opening that was finally opening, like some kind of a little sphincter muscle or something that was finally opening, beginning to open. And it felt like there was a cool breeze that was moving from the top of my head, into me. There was a cool breeze that was going throughout my system from that. Then there were some little prayer experiences by the end of that summer where I was just able to stop and rest and be and just feel that it would open very naturally and the energy would go out and come back in where there was something on the top had opened. I didn't know a thing about chakras or Kundalini energy or any of that stuff. And looking back now, I would say that that fizzling that went on was the beginning of the energy clearing the lower chakras, the throat and the inner eye chakra, and finally beginning to energize the crown chakra. And then by the summer of '88, there was some serious work being done on opening that crown chakra. And that by the end of that summer, it was open. It was open. Then there was no more sense of the old Phil. He was gone. He hasn't been around since. But by then I was through enough of the grieving to say, well, we have a new situation here, you know, and maybe something different will happen emotionally, eventually. But come to think of it, that old person, you know, that we've done away with was, well, wasn't all that great anyway. I mean, there was some shame, some fear, some arrogance. There were things about that old character that caused a lot of trouble. But what in the world was this new person? And Bernadette Roberts didn't help much. She said it's a no-self, or that which remains when self is gone is I guess she's saying Christ is what's left. But I felt it was just a new developmental stage in my life that I would just have to wait and see. In the meantime, the thing that was my responsibility was not figuring that out, but was doing my daily duties, not sinning, meeting my family's responsibilities, and being here now in love. That's all I had to do, was keep walking faithfully in that way and allowing the growth to happen that was going to happen, that was out of my hands anyway. By the fall of '88, I had learned some things about chakras. I had taught some classes on prayer and meditation and had been introduced by some of my students to this. And so I began to read some of the Hindu literature, and I began to see where maybe some of what I had been through was the opening of chakras in a Kundalini process. I didn't really have much literature on it. I had a few things by Ram Dass, and I wanted some more literature. I remember in the spring of '89, I finally came upon some literature while I was doing a workshop in Orlando, Florida. And one of the first books I had was one put out by the Theosophical Society. And it was this old guy, Ledbetter, you know, who wrote a lot for them around the turn of the century. And one of the things he promised in his book was that those who manage to awaken Kundalini but do not understand it can be assured of either death or insanity. I was having a rough time with this all in Orlando at this time, and that was one of the first books on Kundalini that I read. And I knew that I had come close to insanity, that if I had introduced panic thoughts into the process, that I really could have been in very bad shape. If I would have gotten stuck in some judgment about what was happening, it could have been a mess. That my saving grace through the whole thing was to just step out of the way and let it happen, without saying this is good or bad. It seems to be good fruit. I don't know where it's going. Let's continue to let it happen. There was Ledbetter saying that. So I remember going back to my room and saying, my God, what in the world have I got myself into now? And really, you know, having not much of a sense of a God as other to pray to, but nevertheless continuing to say, Lord Jesus, you know, help me to see how to walk with this, or if I need to get out of it, show me how to get out of this, you know. I am literally possessed by this process. It is really taken over. And just really feeling like, you know, that sort of higher guidance that would come as saying, don't worry. That's the worst thing you can do about anything. Don't worry about it. You're doing fine when you just mind your own business and live your life. The only time you make yourself miserable is when you start trying to figure out who you are and what it all means and what it's going to do. Just drop all that stuff and enjoy it, for heaven's sake. Well, that was a pretty good advice, and I still think it's pretty good advice. So I did more and more of that. I continued to read the literature to learn what I could about it, and I learned some things that helped me. I learned some things about posture. I learned some things about diet that are helpful. I learned some things about stretches. I learned some things about clearing energy out and sexuality issues that are part of this that have been helpful. But by and large, I've not learned anything about controlling the process. That seems to still be out of my hands. So by the spring of '88, I was into the literature on Kundalini and trying at the same time to just honor the process, letting it happen without being negative or judgmental about it, just letting it do whatever it's going to do, but trying to learn, I guess, in the way an adolescent would want to learn about adolescence. You know, I'm in this thing called adolescence, and I can't do very much about what's happening to me, but it's still nice to know what is happening to me. What does it mean that my voice is changing and I'm having new ways of knowing and understanding? I think adolescence is a good analogy to the Kundalini process. It's a whole transformation process, organic and otherwise, that kicks in, and it's good to be able to know about it if it's going on in your body and your life. About that time, you and I, Jim, were doing some corresponding about that and trying to make some distinctions, and through you also I was introduced to some helpful writers, Gopi Krishna being one, and some others that were helpful. In '89 also, I started to do some writing about the process, and writing that eventually became published in the book Kundalini Energy and Christian Spirituality. There have been some things that have happened since then, but essentially after that crown chakra was open, that was the last really significant event in the process. Since then, it's been more and more of integrating that's been going on, of allowing the new attentional state to become the normal state, of learning what I can and can't do in daily life, you know, learning how to walk with the process. There's less discomfort for me now here in the summer of 1991 than there has been, you know, since then. That since the summer of '88, the process has become progressively less painful, which is not to say that I am out of the woods by any means. If I get too out of balance in my life, there are painful consequences since that are there for me. Eat too much of the wrong kind of food, not enough quiet time, not enough sleep, all very, very much connected with the proper care of the body, proper nutrition, and so forth. One of the most painful consequences has to do with the ears. It seems that the energy comes up the side of the neck and has to make some kind of turn around the ears before it goes to the third eye area, and then from there on up to the crown and out, and some of it back down into the belly area. That when I've been especially doing too much concentration of a discursive kind, you know, especially when I'm trying to put all this stuff down into some conceptual framework, then I really constrict myself in this throat area, and the energy just can't get into the head, and I have these terrible headaches and pains in the ears. That's the most painful, but there's some very beautiful ongoing things. There is forever with me a pleasant chirping, buzzing, ringing sound in the ears. Maybe it's the noise that they talk about in the East. Like, it's very restful just to stop at any time and tune my attention into that sound. There has been since '88 too, that summer, a growing sense of a feeling person, a reintegration with the feeling self. It's not the old feeling self. It's not the emotional memory of the old Phil. But I am in touch with feelings that I had a long time ago. I'd call them soul feelings. All the other times in my life when I have been awake on a kind of a soul level, a full level, or an ecstatic level, I can feel that. I'm in touch with those old feelings, or God experiences, or whatever we want to call them. So there is now a new sense of emotional continuity, but not with the old ego kind of self that is there. There is also this beautiful experience of the third eye, of a sense of not just seeing out of the two eyes, but out of the forehead, of attention somehow also working out of the forehead that allows me to just be here now and see without getting caught up in interpreting what's happening, just to see it and be with it, and to be one with it in some way, in a kind of a detached way. That is a very beautiful thing. And then what has happened in the last 6 months, the most recent, is a kind of a new awakening on a heart level, that the heart itself is becoming more awake and really feeling a deep love that is somehow in the midst of all of this. It is a love that in my own experience seems to be of God. It is a love that I find myself wanting to say thank you, Lord, or praise you, Lord, about. It's that kind of a love. It's not a romantic kind of love or a friendship kind of love. It's a deep sense of cosmic love. So there are days when all of these things are clicking mighty well. The third eye open and the energy cycling back through, and it's hardly even perceptible. When all is well, you can't even experience this energy. It seems to be you only experience when there are blocks or when it's pushing into some new area. With the heart open, it's beautiful. I mean, it's incredibly beautiful. And I would now say worth all the pain that I've been through about it. So it's come out quite nicely. It's made even a big difference in the marriage. It's deepened my love for my wife, a new patience with my children, a real love for nature. The biggest change, I guess, has been in my ability to do lots of reading, where in 74, 75, 76 I would read and read and read and read and read. I now have great difficulty reading even a little bit of stuff that is a reflection on the spiritual journey. It's almost as though when I read a little bit of theology or philosophical reflection or metaphysical reflection, I get all confused and all preoccupied about whether I understand things right, and I lose touch with my, I don't know what it I get all out of sorts when I read. And I wish I knew everything that the book was saying. I have no problem talking with a person about what's in a book. If somebody were to bring me a book and say, you got to read this, and I'd read it, I'd get all screwed up. But if I'd say to them, tell me what you like about that book. Tell me what you really got turned on about. And we would talk, it would be fine. No problem. So that's a strange thing there. The inability any longer to do that kind of reading that is about conceptualization on the journey. It's as though it has me trying to reflect on my union with God, which I'm not even aware of, which, unlike the past, I used to be able to say, well, it's inside of me. It's a union that's within me that I can be aware of. It's non-dual in the unconscious, but it's dual, conscious to unconscious. Now I say, I don't know where it is. It's somewhere. It's I am and God is and we are, and that's all there is to it. And it's not within. There's no longer even a sense very much of interiority. It's as though I'm in God, and so God's in me too, but it's all. Then when I try to reflect on that, it really has me out of sorts for sometimes 3 to 5 days after I'll read just a little bitty old thing. And I've got all these wonderful books that people keep sending me that I wish I knew what was in them, but when I don't read, I understand everything I'm supposed to understand. I know what I need to know. And so where it's taken me is a very beautiful place, where there is no fear, no shame, no guilt, no resentment, incredible peace, and a growing sense of a deep, deep cosmic love that I'm sure must be about God in some way.